In the autumn of 1879, a 16-year-old boy stood at the edge of his father's farm, a small bag slung over his shoulder. His boots dusted with the earth he was leaving behind. The land had been his family's legacy, but not his destiny. His heart wasn't in plows and harvests. It beat for something faster, something mechanical, something revolutionary. With determination in his step, he set off for Detroit, a city buzzing with industry and possibility. At the time, the world moved at the pace of horse-drawn carriages and steam-powered trains. The few automobiles that existed were mere playthings for the wealthy. Wild machines built more for spectacle than for everyday life. But this boy, this farm boy with grease-stained hands and a head full of ideas, would change all that. 35 years later, the world no longer crawled, roared. Roads stretched across continents, engines hummed in every town, and half of all the cars on Earth carried his name. Henry Ford had done more than build a car company. He had built a movement, a revolution in motion. And this is his story. The summer air was thick with the scent of freshly tilled soil, and the steady hum of crickets filled the evening sky. A boy stood in the middle of his father's farm, gripping a wrench instead of a plow, while the rest of his family saw the land as their livelihood. He saw it as a cage. Henry Ford was born on July 30, 1863, in what would later be known as Dearborn, Michigan. His father, William Ford, had built a life on the farm, one that he expected his eldest son to continue. But Henry wasn't like his father. While the other children learned to sow and harvest, Henry dreamed of gears, cogs, and steam. Farming was grueling, slow, repetitive, and demanding. Henry did his share of the work, but his heart was never in it. "I never had any particular love for the farm," he would later say. "It was the mother on the farm I loved." Unlike most boys his age, Henry wasn't drawn to school either. He found the lessons dull, the routine suffocating. He preferred to learn with his hands, taking apart anything mechanical he could find. His world changed at the age of 12 when his father gifted him a pocket watch. To others it was just a timepiece, but to Henry it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. He carefully pried it open, studied its intricate gears, and with practiced precision put it back together. Soon he was repairing watches for neighbors, unknowingly taking his first steps toward an engineering mind that would one day change the world. At 13, during a school trip to Detroit, Henry saw something that sent a jolt through his soul: a steam engine. It hissed and roared, alive with power and motion. From that moment, machinery became his obsession. By 15, he had built his first small steam engine, a mechanical marvel in the eyes of a farm boy. But fate had its own plans. When Henry was still a teenager, his beloved mother, Mary Ford, passed away. The loss shattered him. The farm, once merely a place he disliked, became unbearable. Every corner of it reminded him of her. Her voice, her laughter, the warmth she brought to a life he had no love for. He had to leave. At 16, against his father's wishes, Henry packed his things and walked away from the farm, away from the life that had been chosen for him. With nothing but his mechanical mind and a relentless drive, he set off toward the city, toward Detroit. He didn't know exactly where the road would take him, but one thing was certain: he wasn't looking back. This was the beginning of something much greater. Detroit in the late 1800s was alive with the hum of progress. The steam engine was revolutionizing industry, and the city pulsed with opportunity for young minds eager to build the future. Among them was a restless 16-year-old named Henry Ford, who arrived with little more than determination and an insatiable curiosity for machines. He found work at the Michigan Car Company Works, a streetcar manufacturing company, but his enthusiasm was met with misfortune. He was fired just 6 days into the job. Undeterred, he wandered through periods of unemployment until landing an apprenticeship at James Flower & Brothers machine shop. It paid a meager $2.60 a week, barely enough to survive. But Henry was resourceful. To make ends meet, he leaned into his childhood talent, fixing watches, working nights as a jeweler for an extra $3 a week. Despite the long hours, Exhaustion never dulled his hunger for knowledge. Every spare moment was spent studying, experimenting, and absorbing everything he could about machines. By 1882, at 19 years old, Henry made the unexpected decision to return home to Michigan. Farming still held no appeal, but his father had unknowingly given him a gift. On the farm sat a portable steam engine, a new innovation transforming agriculture. Henry was fascinated. He spent hours dismantling, repairing, and mastering the machine. Soon word of his expertise spread, and neighbors sought him out, willing to pay him to operate their steam engines. His reputation reached the ears of the Westinghouse Engine Company, a rising force in industrial machinery. Impressed by his skill, they hired him to travel across southern Michigan, setting up and servicing steam tractor engines. It was a dream come true. He was finally working with machines, no longer tied to a life he didn't want. Then, in 1885, fate introduced him to Clara Jane Bryant at a New Year's Eve party. A year later they were engaged. As a wedding gift, Henry's father presented him with 40 acres of land. But where his father saw farmland, Henry saw possibility. He wasn't going to grow crops. He was going to build something far greater. And so, with a pocket full of dreams and an unshakable resolve, Henry Ford took another step toward changing the world. In 1891, Henry and Clara Ford moved into a small apartment in Detroit, their lives modest but brimming with ambition. It was here, in the flickering glow of gas lamps, that Henry stumbled upon an idea that would consume him entirely. One evening, while flipping through a British magazine, he read about a revolutionary machine, a gas-powered engine. Unlike the slow, cumbersome steam engines of the time, this new invention didn't require a 30-minute warm-up. It sparked to life instantly, burning fuel internally. The concept fascinated Henry. It was the work of a German engineer named Nikolaus Otto, and while it was gaining popularity in Europe, few in America had even heard of it. Henry had to see one for himself. He scoured the city and eventually found someone who owned a gas engine. The moment he laid eyes on it, he was captivated. It was compact, powerful, and elegant in its simplicity. But there was one problem: he had no idea how it worked. The engine's ignition relied on electricity, a mystery that left him both frustrated and intrigued. Determined to unravel its secrets, Henry took a job as a night engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company, the largest electric company in Detroit, earning $40 a month. His job was simple: maintain the massive steam engine that powered electricity to 1,000 homes. When the machine ran smoothly, he had nothing but time on his hands. And Henry used that time wisely. Night after night, he immersed himself in the study of electricity, dissecting its principles, understanding its flow, and preparing for the day he would bring his own machine to life. In 1893, Henry and Clara welcomed their first and only child, Edsel Bryant Ford. Just 3 months later, Henry's relentless pursuit of knowledge paid off. He was promoted to chief engineer, with his salary soaring to $100 a week. With financial security came the freedom to dream even bigger. That same year, after countless hours of trial and error, he built his first working gas engine, a small but groundbreaking step toward his vision of a horseless carriage. The world, however, wouldn't see his dream in motion until the early morning hours of June 4, 1896. At precisely 1:30 a.m. in the quiet of the night, Henry Ford completed his first experimental automobile, a crude but functional machine he called the quadricycle. It was a simple contraption: 2 bicycle frames placed side by side, powered by a gasoline engine. The quadricycle had 2 gears but no reverse function. Worse, it lacked a cooling system, causing it to overheat after only a short drive. But Henry was never one to be discouraged by flaws. He was inspired by them. He refined the vehicle, adding a cooling system and improving its mechanics. And when he was satisfied, he sold it for $200, using the money to fund his next, even grander project. Henry Ford wasn't just building a car. He was building a revolution, one that would soon change the world forever. Henry Ford had always been a man of ambition, But ambition alone wasn't enough to keep a business afloat. In 1899, with the backing of Detroit's mayor and a wealthy lumber merchant named William Murphy, Henry set out to build something greater than his first crude automobiles. By July of that year, he unveiled his second experimental car, larger, sturdier, and more refined than its predecessor. Murphy was so impressed after a test drive that he saw potential in Henry's vision and, in August 1899, the Detroit Automobile Company was born. Seemed like a promising start. It wasn't. The company collapsed within a year. The reasons were plenty. Investors wanted passenger cars for the wealthy, but Henry was obsessed with perfecting his designs, tweaking every detail until it met his standards. Worse, car production was slow and unreliable. Parts had to be ordered from various suppliers, and any delay meant the entire factory stood still, wasting time and money. In 2 years, the company managed to produce just 20 vehicles. That wasn't business. It was a disaster. Investors lost patience. Henry was fired from his own company. But rather than feeling crushed, Henry felt relieved. Failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently, he later wrote. With the weight of investors off his back, Henry turned his focus to something faster, riskier, and far more exciting: racing cars. At the time, automobile racing was exploding in popularity across the United States. Henry saw it not just as a sport but as a stage, a way to prove that his cars weren't just machines, they were the best machines. However, after his failure with the Detroit Automobile Company, few were willing to believe in him. Investors were scarce. So he did what he did best: he built. In 1901, Henry designed a new racing car, a sleek and powerful machine that would be tested in a head-to-head showdown against Cleveland automaker Alexander Winton, one of the nation's leading racers. The race was held in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. Henry's car won. The victory changed everything. Henry Ford, the man who had just been cast aside by investors, was suddenly the talk of the town. His 26-horsepower racing machine had beaten one of the biggest names in American motorsports. And just like that, confidence in him was restored. Investors lined up, ready to back him once again. And so, in 1903, the Ford Motor Company was born. But history has a way of repeating itself. Once again, the investors wanted passenger cars, and once again, Henry couldn't stop building race cars. His relentless focus on speed over mass production infuriated the board, and in a bold move, they brought in Henry Martin Leland, an experienced engineer, to replace him. Henry Ford, frustrated and unwilling to take orders, walked away. "I resigned, determined never again to put myself under orders," he later wrote in his autobiography. Leland, on the other hand, took control and renamed the company. That company, Cadillac. But Henry wasn't done. Not even close. Teaming up with former racing cyclist Tom Cooper, he returned to what he loved: building cars built for speed. In 1902, they unveiled a beast of a machine, the Ford 999, a car with 80 horsepower, more than 3 times the power of his first racing car. The driver, Barney Oldfield, a former bicycle racer who had never driven a car before in his life. Yet, against all odds, the Ford 999 dominated the racetrack, defeating Winton's cars once again. By 1904, Ford's newest car had set a new American land speed record, reaching 91.4 miles per hour. By now, Henry Ford wasn't just a car builder. He was a legend. And legends attract investors. With his reputation at its peak, Henry knew that when the time came to launch his third and final company, he wouldn't have to beg for money. Investors would come to him. And when they did, he would change the world forever. Henry Ford had tasted failure twice before. But this time he was determined. This time he would not fail. With 11 investors behind him, including Detroit coal dealer Alexander Young Malcolmson, Henry launched his third and final attempt at building an automobile company. Initially called Ford and Malcolmson Limited, the company was later renamed Ford Motor Company in 1902. Ford had a vision unlike any other. At the time, automobiles were a luxury, exclusive machines built by elite engineers, reserved for the rich or the reckless racers. The average American couldn't even dream of owning a car. Henry wanted to change that. Gathering his investors and engineers, he made a bold declaration. I will build a motor car for the great multitude, constructed of the best materials, by the best men, following the simplest designs that modern engineering can devise, so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one. Henry knew that making an affordable car wasn't just about design. It was about production. He poured himself into the work. Over 20 different prototypes were tested before he landed on one that worked. The Model A. It was a solid start, but Henry wasn't satisfied. Over the next 5 years he kept refining, perfecting, and improving each design. The Model A led to the Model N, a sleek and reliable car that became the best-selling vehicle in America. But Henry's real breakthrough wasn't just about the car. It was about how it was built. From his previous failures, he had learned a crucial lesson. Relying on multiple suppliers for car parts led to delays, inefficiencies, and slow production. So Henry took control. He built his own manufacturing facilities, ensuring that engines, transmissions, and every critical component came from a single, well-organized source. Then, in 1904, during a trip to Chicago, Henry stumbled upon an idea that would revolutionize the industry. Inside a slaughterhouse, he watched as workers efficiently butchered animals along a moving assembly line. Instead of one person working on an entire product, each worker performed a single specialized task, making the process much faster. Henry's mind lit up. What if cars could be built this way? Returning to Detroit, he raised more capital and built a new factory, employing over 300 workers. It was inside this factory that he began experimenting with assembly line production. By 1906, the concept had already increased Ford's production speed fivefold. But Henry still wasn't done. He continued refining both his process and his materials, leading to one of his most significant discoveries: vanadium steel, a material 3 times stronger and far lighter than traditional steel. With this breakthrough, Henry was finally ready to create his ultimate machine. And in 1908 he did. A business absolutely devoted to service will have only one worry about profits. They will be embarrassingly large. Henry Ford had one goal: to build a car for the people, not just the elite, not just the racers, but everyone. That car was the Model T. At first, it was one of the most expensive vehicles Henry had ever built, priced at $850. Equivalent to around $21,000 today. Yet, despite its cost, demand exploded. Within days of its release, 15,000 orders poured in. The Ford Motor Company became the #1 car company in America practically overnight. Henry had done it. He had failed, learned, innovated, and changed the world. But as Ford's empire rose, so did a new challenge. One that would test not just his company, but his vision itself. What else could he want? Perhaps the real question was, what was next? By 1910, Henry Ford had a problem, but the best kind of problem. His Model T was selling like wildfire, and demand was soaring. To keep up, he needed to mass-produce cars at an unprecedented scale. So he built a bigger, bolder factory in Highland Park, Michigan. This wasn't just any factory. It was the birthplace of a revolution. Henry and his engineers experimented relentlessly. They asked a simple but game-changing question. Why should workers move around the car when the car could move to them? By 1913, their answer took shape. The assembly line. Cars were now pulled down the line, built piece by piece. The time to make a single Model T dropped from 12 hours to just 90 minutes. The results were staggering. By 1915, Ford was producing more than 300,000 cars a year, more than all other automakers combined. And by 1920, the number of Model Ts built had skyrocketed from 20,000 to nearly 1 million. At one point, half of all the cars on Earth were Fords. Ford's genius didn't stop at production. He knew that the more cars he made, the cheaper he could sell them. When the Model T first launched, it cost $850. A hefty price for most Americans. But as production ramped up, Henry dropped the price every year. By 1917, A Model T sold for less than $400. Suddenly, the dream of owning a car wasn't just for the rich. It was for everyone. But success brought a new challenge. One that no machine could solve. While the assembly line made history, it also made Ford's workers miserable. The once proud craftsmen who used to build entire cars were now stuck repeating the same small task all day long. Many found the work tedious, frustrating, even demeaning. Skilled laborers walked away in droves, leaving for jobs where their talents were valued. If this continued, Ford's factory, his empire, would grind to a halt. In a bold and unexpected move, Henry doubled wages overnight. He raised his workers' pay to $5 a day, an unheard of sum. Other companies laughed. They called it financial suicide, predicting that Ford would bankrupt himself. But Henry had the last laugh. Mechanics from every corner of America flooded to Detroit, eager for a chance at a high-paying Ford job. Skilled workers stayed, turnover rates plummeted, and Ford's production ran smoother than ever. He didn't stop there. He cut working hours and added a third shift, turning Ford into a 24-hour operation. Rival companies, terrified of losing their best workers, had no choice but to follow. Once again, Henry Ford had reshaped the business world, this time by proving that treating workers well wasn't just good ethics, it was good business. We believe in making 25,000 men prosperous and contented, rather than following the plan of making a few slave drivers in our multimillionaire establishments. By 1919, Ford had one last obstacle: his own investors. Tired of their interference, Henry made a drastic decision. He bought every single one of them out. The result: Detroit gained a few new millionaires. But more importantly, Henry Ford became the sole owner of the largest automobile company in the world. He handed the title of company president to his 26-year-old son, Edsel Ford. But everyone knew who really ran the show. Yet, absolute power came at a price, one even the richest man in America couldn't ignore. Because when you build an empire, you also build enemies. And Henry Ford was about to face his greatest challenge yet. For years, Henry Ford ruled the roads. His Model T had transformed the automobile from a luxury into an everyday necessity. He believed, with unshakable certainty, that this was the only car people needed. But the world was changing. By the late 1920s, a new kind of car was stealing the spotlight: sleek, stylish, and comfortable. Chevrolet and Chrysler were gaining ground, offering features that made the Model T look ancient in comparison. Still, Henry refused to budge. His own executives, his engineers, even his son, Edsel, pleaded with him. It's time for something new. But Henry Ford wasn't a man who changed his mind easily. Sales plummeted. By the time Henry finally caved in 1927, it was too late. He shut down the Model T assembly line and introduced a new car, the Model A. But even this wasn't enough to reclaim Ford's throne. Determined to rebuild his empire, Henry Ford dreamed bigger than ever. He constructed a massive new factory along the Rouge River in Michigan. This wasn't just a plant, it was a self-sustaining machine, capable of producing everything a car needed, from steel to tires to glass. It became the largest factory in the world. But Henry's grip on power was proving to be more of a curse than a blessing. While competitors like General Motors and Chrysler were adapting to change, Ford stuck to his old ways. Even his brilliant V8 engine couldn't save the company from slipping. By 1936, Ford had fallen to third place in the U.S. automobile market. Then the Great Depression hit. Factories closed. Workers were laid off. Ford was forced to slash prices just to survive. Tragedy struck in 1943 when Edsel Ford, Henry's beloved son, died of stomach cancer. Heartbroken and exhausted, Henry clung to the company for 2 more years before finally passing the torch to his grandson, Henry Ford II. The man who had changed the world retreated to his estate, where he lived out his final years. On April 7, 1947, Henry Ford took his last breath. The visionary who had put the world on wheels was gone. But his legacy, that would last forever. The Ford Motor Company, once on the brink of collapse, rose again under new leadership. Today, it remains one of the biggest car manufacturers in the world, with a market cap of around $70 billion. Henry Ford may have been stubborn, bold, and controversial, but his impact on history is undeniable. He didn't just build cars, he built an industry, and the road he paved still stretches on today. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give me a like and subscribe.